In this cassette, we will examine the dynamics of labor management negotiations. Our first interview is with Mr. Lee Paterson, who is the senior partner in the management labor law firm of Paterson Taggert, located in Palos Verdes Estates, California. Lee's firm specializes in the representation of management in employer-employee relations problems, including union organizing campaigns, collective bargaining negotiations, and legal cases. In addition, Paterson Taggert trains managers and executives to more effectively handle their negotiating responsibilities. In our conversation, Lee covers a wide range of areas, including, first, the critical factors affecting the outcome of labor management negotiations. Second, how leverage is gained and used in these negotiations. And third, how various strategies and tactics are used in the dynamics of labor management negotiations. What do you perceive, based on your experiences, as some of the critical factors which affect the outcome of labor management negotiations?
Well, that's probably one of the most difficult questions that I've ever had answered me. If I could give you a straight answer to that, I probably could bottle it and make a million. But
that's why I asked it.
Okay. I jotted down some ideas that I had along those lines, and I think I can bring them into specific terms. Let me see if I can. I see one of the most critical factors in labor negotiations is information. Both the giving and the getting of information at the table and away from the table can make or break your negotiation. For example, I had a negotiation at a table a long time ago where one of the demands by one of the employees was that there be an increase in pay in a certain classification, or I shouldn't say by one of the employees. The demand was by the bargaining team. And it didn't make sense because it was hanging up the entire negotiations package. And we're going along, and the thing that keeps getting hung up on whether we're going to give a 15% boost to this one classification or not, and my people keep telling me no, and I keep saying no, and they keep saying yes. And finally, I took a break, and I go off with my group, and I fed them dinner, and I start in on this thing. I say, now, why is it that they keep making this 15% package? And they look at me in sort of disgust because I don't realize the obvious, and I said, what's the matter? And they say, well, don't you know that Fred sitting on the team is one of those people? The fact is, he's the only people in the organization that's going to get the 15%. The whole clue to that negotiation was information, that somebody had to tell me as the chief negotiator that Fred had it. Having had that information, it was easy to go back to the table and undermine Fred at the table in such a way that his people turned against him, and they dropped the issue rather quickly. But the clue to it was information. Sometimes a lot of times that information you get away from the table. You call up a negotiator on the other side and you say, how does your buddy over there negotiate? Or you call up another management rep and you say, what's he like? Can you trust him? Does he have credibility? How do you handle the last negotiation? That kind of information gathering is, in my opinion, 90% of successful negotiations. And it includes wages an hour, what are comparative wages and hours, how do people deal, what are the issues at the table, what are the personalities, what's your own client like? You can get shot down by your client as fast as anybody else. That kind of information is 90% of successful negotiations. I think one of the other things that's evident at any table that you bargain at, but particularly in the private sector, is a concept called bargaining power. Who's got the muscle, who can use it? If you're dealing with the Teamsters Union and you're a small trucking company that's got 2 trucks, and you deliver only to the docks in the harbor, and you pick up only at union terminals, and the union calls you up and says, we've got the master freight agreement and 4,000 truckers in our area have signed that, we'd like you to sign it, and you sit down with them to negotiate, and you say, well, we'd like to perhaps propose a $2 an hour less than the master freight agreement as our initial proposal. You lack something called bargaining power, and in that situation, without that critical element, nothing else is going to help you. There is no negotiation in that sense. It's a take it or leave it type of proposal. Either take it or leave it, and that's the end of the negotiation. Now, sometimes that'll work. That can work to your advantage. Sometimes you've got bargaining power. I had a restaurant negotiation recently where they had a master agreement. Everybody had the same contract. And I sat down with the union representing the restaurant, and I said, we're not going to give you that. We're going to go with a $1.50 an hour wage increase, which the union agent was shocked at because it was so much money. However, we're not going to give you the union pension plan. We're not going to give you union health and welfare plan, and we're not going to give you agency or a union shop, so that none of, those people that want to join will join, and those that don't. Well, of course, what I had just done was establish bargaining power with the employees and eliminate the union's bargaining power, because he had no ability to give me that deal, but the employees wanted the $1.50, so he lost his bargaining power, and I picked it up. And that's the type of reverse bargaining power that you can have. The third thing I jotted down was the thing called communication. The ability to communicate your viewpoint at 2 levels, or maybe 3 levels. Management's ability to communicate across the table. And a lot of negotiators don't have that ability. I have made a lot of mistakes at the table saying something, thinking the guy across the table understood what I was saying, and found out later he didn't. And sometimes you have to say it one way, and then you have to say it another way, and then you have to say it like you're trying to communicate with your 3-year-old kid without talking down, because they just don't understand sometimes heavy issues or complicated issues, and you just have to keep coming across in different ways. So the ability to communicate across the table can many times be the critical factor. But not just across the table. In a private sector negotiation, many times you want to communicate with employees. You want to get the information out to the employees about what you're offering, or what the management's position is, or the fact that management is saying at the table, we're going belly up if this doesn't work. I had an interesting and unusual negotiation for me recently. I negotiated in a small chemical company with 10 total employees. And we're getting nowhere with the union because we're proposing a 0% salary increase, and somehow or another they just couldn't see their way fit to do that, and the committee wouldn't buy that. So the negotiations dragged on for 8 months, and our whole position is we can't afford it. And we invited the union in to look at the books. They had an auditor come in, they checked the books, the auditor reported back we couldn't afford it. So we sit down with the union agent and the committee again, we say 0, and he says, I can't agree to it. So we stumbled along for a little while, and then somebody came up with the right answer, and the right answer in this case was, let's meet with all of them. And we had a big meeting, we had a big square table, we brought Cokes and sandwiches, we brought all the employees in, and we went over the auditor's report, we went over all of the negotiations, the union presented its argument, and we made our final offer, which was nothing, for 15 months, and at the end of that time we would take another look at it. And we left the room, we came back to the room 3 hours later, and we had a contract for 18 months for nothing. And it was just a question of communicating with the people that were making the decision. That can work against you, though, because the union's smart that way, too, and they do a thing that management calls the end run, where they get to the top guy on the bargaining. And I got my stripes on that in my first bargaining session ever. I was bargaining for a small company, and they got bought out by a large conglomerate. And the large conglomerate had a lot of service stations attached to it. And I was dealing with the construction union, and they were sure they were going to pick at their little service stations. So they sent in their acquisition manager, who was a negotiator of another ilk. He was not a labor negotiator, but he was certainly a commercial negotiator. And he came in his Mercedes, and heavy set, and good-looking guy with the gray sideburns. And we went out and had negotiations, and I'm giving the straight line. We're going for a management rights clause, and not going to have a union shop, and we're not giving in to your $2 an hour wage increase. And afterwards, this is all over, the union attorney on the other side, brilliant man, very smart, sensed what was going on. And he says, well, let's go out to dinner. We'll pay for dinner. And I'm going, oh my God, here it comes. So we all go out to dinner. And at the bar, the union attorney sidles up to my client, the wheeler dealer, and he says, real quietly, but I picked up what was going on, says, we really ought to settle this, we can put you right out of business in 5 minutes. He says, that $2 an hour is peanuts compared to your big operation. The guy says, you're right. He says, would you take $1.50? And he says, no, but I'll take $1.75. And they settle for easily 75% over the going wage in the industry, because the going wage was about would have taken about a 50-cent increase to protect his service stations. Well, that's communication around the other way, and it happens a lot, and it's smart. It's really smart, and I'd have done it to him too if I'd had half a chance.
Okay, so a couple of things that you've mentioned kind of relate to the next question that I want to ask you. first, you mentioned bargaining power, and then communications, which is also a form of leverage. The term communications and bargaining power are types of leverage. What are some of the major types of leverage used in labor management relations, and how do labor and management attempt to strengthen their leverage vis-a-vis each other?
Well, that's different if you're talking about a public agency or you're talking about a private sector corporation. The leverages in negotiations are entirely different from my perspective. In the private sector, the leverage is largely economic. It's the question of the bottom line. And the head of the corporation looks at his profit and loss statement theoretically and says, if I go with this with the union, what's it going to cost me? If I take a strike, what's it going to cost me?
In the private sector.
In the private sector. And he makes a calculated risk. Now, once in a while you run into the lower level manager who's afraid for his job if he has a strike. And so he makes his decision, his bargaining power in that sense is made on job security. But most of the time it's the bottom line in the agency. And the union goes after anything that will affect that bottom line. The secondary boycott, the strike, the going to the competitor and cutting a better deal, which puts the guy on the borderline of failure if he doesn't go along with the same deal. All of those kinds of things, the traditional private sector economic tools are there. And the way you strengthen those in the private sector are pretty staid and pretty matter of fact. We don't get in the private sector much in the way of surprises. You get the end run like the guy with the wheeler dealer. You get the consumer boycott where the union goes out to all your customers and sends them letters and puts up a little picket sign, an informational picket sign. You get mass picketing. You get a little bit of violence sometimes, not usually by the union in this part of the country, but by the employees. So you don't get a lot of interesting or to me interesting, but different types of tactics. It's pretty traditional. It's been around for about 30, 40 years. The leverage in the public sector is not the bottom line. It's rare that a public sector manager or a elected official says, we can't afford this because it's going to put us in the red, largely because it's just a shifting of priorities, and they shift the priorities. Once in a while, in the city of New York, as an example, when they're on the bottom line, then they really do say that, but they've got to be right up against the wall before they say it. The tactics there are entirely different, and some of the tactics there are really novel and maybe in a sense to me frightening. Some of the things that I have seen happen in the last few years are teacher associations putting enough money into local elections that they elect board members, a majority of the board, to support them. We had that happen 3 or 4 times this year to us, where we're in negotiations. Suddenly the teachers get a majority on the board goes into executive session and instructs the negotiator, if they even deal with the negotiator, and says, give them anything they want, because they elected us. Now that's a very clever way of increasing your leverage at the bargaining table, because it gives you 100% leverage. Another variation of that we saw is we saw 2 business agents for teacher locals, if I can use that term. That's not the right term, but it's close enough. Switch off with each other on opposite boards of education, so that one of them became the board member in the district that the other one was the association rep for, and the association rep in that district became the board member for the other association rep, so they immediately fed each other cross information about what was going on in negotiations, so that they had the perfect communications tool as to where management was going, because they were sitting in the executive sessions, in effect, for management. We saw another one this year where the board members wouldn't go along with a salary increase with teachers, and to punish them, the teachers sponsored a recall campaign against 3 of the board members, the 3 who hadn't voted for the salary increase that they wanted, and they won the recall campaign. Now, they didn't use the salary issue, they used other educational issues, but they knocked the 3 board members out who had not voted for them, and that's a very powerful tool to convince surrounding board members that you go along with the power source or you don't get to be a board member in our community. And that's another fairly innovative approach. The management does some of the same things too. Since the ultimate decision maker is the public, who's going to vote for who, we saw a school board this year get a proposal from a teachers association that said, and in some place in 92 pages of language that was going to run the show, it said that the board will not discriminate against teachers based on sexual preference. Well, that was probably the only really hot issue in there, and they jumped on it. And they let the paper know that the teachers were trying to protect people who were homosexuals and transsexuals, and that they might even be trying to protect people who had preferences for children and animals and fire hydrants and anything else that somebody might be interested in. And the whole community turned out at a mass meeting of the board to demand that the board not give in to these sexual child molester types. And the teachers pulled the 92-page package and came back with about a 10 or 15-page moderate proposal.
You've given us some ideas on the types of leverage that are used by both labor and management. Based on what you see as these different types of leverage, different tactics being used, what are some of the basic strategies for labor management negotiations?
Well, I suppose the basic strategies are really preparation for and utilization of the critical factors and the leverage. If you get right down to basics, it's how do you get together so you can put on a communications program which will give you the leverage to pull off what you're looking for. But there are some of the things we try to tell our clients are that, number one, you don't pull off a labor relations strategy or labor relations program unless you've got a common philosophy on the part of the management. We're faced an awful lot, both in the public and private sector, with the varying philosophy. You sit down, you talk with a company president, and he says, boy, we're going all the way. We know the strike's coming, and we're ready for it. Then you go down with the warehouse manager who's going to sit with you in negotiations, and it's fear and trembling unto death because he's not ready for a strike and he's not about to prepare for it and he just wants a settlement in the worst way, and he's sitting next to you at the table communicating this physical appearance and his body language, and at the same time out in the warehouse he's not implementing the directives you give him to get ready for the strike, and you go back to company president and you get into an intermanagement wangle as to who's running the show. Is it going to be the warehouse manager or the president? Now, normally in that situation, it's the president. But it's not unusual to get into three-tier types of programs where you've got a middle-level manager who wants a settlement, a hardline president, and maybe a hardline warehouse manager, so to speak, and they're battling each other, and they're consuming so much, quote, organizational energy, unquote, that they never get ready to handle labor relations problems. And you're spending your time dealing with them rather than getting a unified front. So we try to bring our clients together in training and in the actual negotiations and say, look, if you really want to successfully handle this negotiation or this labor problem or this consumer boycott or whatever it is, you've got to get together and decide that you're all on the same philosophy. That ties in with the other approach of what is called a management team. And a management team tends to be taken for granted a lot in the private sector. I think a lot of times it shouldn't be taken for granted because I've been shot down by people who are not on the, quote, management team who are supposed to be, even high-level executives. I've seen some retirement programs go through in negotiations that shouldn't have gone through and didn't have to go through other than the fact that the chief executive was 62 years old and he was looking for some upgrade in the corporate benefits. It's very critical in the public sector, though. A lot of public sector managers are having a very hard time considering themselves management. They consider themselves public administrators, educators, firemen, even though they're the fire chief and they haven't been in the smoke for 20 years, or policemen, even though they've got a rusty gun in their pocket or aren't even carrying a gun. The guy who is still considering himself one of the guys and not one of the managers. He doesn't look at himself as an executive, and we try to bring those people around to the idea that they are executives or managers and they're on a team and that they're part of an overall management strategy. The major other strategy we try to use is to try to introduce, if it's possible at all, into labor negotiations the concept of needs negotiation, that there really is a joint purpose here. Management and labor, the union and the management, are still going to be here 20 years from now, and they need each other. And if either one of them kills each other, draws blood at the table, then they're going to pay for it later on in some other negotiation. So that the needs of both parties are to leave each other in a healthy position that's fair, and the needs of the employees are to have a fair salary increase in comparison to the economy and in comparison to what other people are getting. The needs of management is to get a fair return on its investment or a fair profit, insofar as you don't have to negotiate that issue at the table, but you bring that issue forward as part of the realities of the situation. Or in the public sector, you talk about the service to the community for a fair tax rate or for a fair amount of money coming into the agency. If you can get to that level of negotiation and labor negotiation, which is very difficult, it's not the traditional labor negotiation, but if you can get people on that kind of a needs analysis basis, and no one's playing a double-edged game with you where they say, yeah, we're needs analyzing, needs negotiating, but we really aren't. You can get some very effective negotiations going, because once people start to realize that there are some joint needs at the table, then they can break down and start really doing some effective communication. Strategy of credibility, that you don't say anything at the table that you can't come through with. So the union doesn't say we're going on strike if they've said that 20 times in the last 5 years, and every time you forced them to the wall, they broke down. Or vice versa. I have a client now that is telling me that they're going to have a strike next Thursday. Yet for the last 10 years, we have gone till 7:59 in the morning before the 8 o'clock bell rings, and they settle at 7:59 every time, and the employee's standing out on the street. And there's not a man in that plant right now who believes that next Thursday morning at 7:59 we're not really going to have a strike. And I mean, we're not going to have a settlement, and I have my doubts. As their chief negotiator, I'm not sure we're not going to have a settlement, but they keep telling me we're not going to have a settlement. So 7:59 we'll find out if they come up with what the union's demanding. That's credibility, and that's an important strategy. The other things that are the strategies are implementing, like getting the employee communications going, or getting the public communications going for the union. Those kinds of strategies are part of a long run of where are we going, what are we going to do, type of thing that you've got to do at the table.
Lee, what clues can a negotiator search for which will indicate that the opposing party is willing to bargain as opposed to being in a win-lose situation where no bargaining occurs?
In labor relations, you are generally dealing with an ongoing relationship, sort of like a husband-wife team, so that you have a history of the relationship to look at. And in most cases, you find out that somebody's in a win-lose situation, not so much by what's going on at the bargaining table, but by what's going on outside of the bargaining table. For example, if you're sitting, in fact, as I was sitting with a negotiator earlier this year, who I'm now convinced was in an absolute win-lose situation. He had a package on the table which he wanted to win, and if he got that whole package, then in his mind, and I think in the community's mind, I would have lost. I found out about that, was sure of that was occurring, when I noticed that there were 24 unexpected faces roaming around among the employees. And upon checking, found out these people were visitors from Chicago and New York and Denver and San Francisco and Los Angeles, who had been brought in by this guy to be the strike leaders. And at that point, I realized I was in a win-lose situation, and I handled the negotiations from that point. So you'll find you find out largely from outside sources of unexpected faces, or by what their publications are to their own employees, or by what went on at their quote-unquote ratification meeting, or those kinds of things. You can also many times anticipate it in labor negotiations by asking yourself, who is this guy and what does he want? If he's a heavy from the Teamsters Union and he's just about to go into the master freight negotiations, and you happen to be a large freight company with 3,000 employees that's not in the master freight negotiations, you know that you are the target for the master freight negotiations, and you're probably not dealing in what you'd call a totally win-win situation. You are much more likely dealing in a win-lose, because if he gets what he wants, then master freight follows, or some other master contract, that kind of an example. So I always look at the outside. Now, once in a while you can get snookered, particularly on individual issues in a table where there's a win-lose situation going on and you don't know it. The easiest way to find that out, or at least the way I use, is I'll use bait. I'll take an issue which he ought to be really happy to get, and I'll dangle it, and I will even make some compromises on it, maybe off the table or on the table, to see what, if I'm getting nibbles. And if I'm not getting nibbles, then I know I'm not fishing, and I'm not dealing in a win-win situation. I'm dealing in win-lose, and I take whatever the appropriate action is then. So I deal differently then after I find that out. But those are the ways I generally find out about win-lose. And win-lose in labor negotiations is a goal to be devoutly cherished, but rarely a successful one on either side. Everybody thinks that they're going to pull off a win-lose, and it's maybe one time out of 100 that you find a win-lose situation. So that they, even though you watch for them and make sure you're not baited into one, they're not generally there.
Before the negotiation process starts, each negotiator has to decide how firm their initial positions will be and how much flexibility they should indicate to the opposing party. What factors should a negotiator consider in determining how firm these initial positions should be?
Well, I think there are only two factors in labor negotiations you consider when you're talking about how firm your position should be at a table. One is your, quote, bargaining power, whether that's community support in the public sector or economic power in the private sector. That's the thing that determines how firm you're going to be. If you got bargaining power, you can run all the way. If you haven't got bargaining power, then you're in the second criteria for determining whether you're how firm to be, and that's called bluff. And that's a matter of credibility. How well can I convince the party on the other side that what I'm saying is true and that he's going to have to buy in to my position? And there's the only thing worse than being firm at the bargaining table and then settling at the 13th or the 11th hour is being firm at the bargaining table and settling at the 13th hour, because you've destroyed your credibility. If you go till 7:59 in the morning on the morning of the strike and then you settle 2 times in a row, you can bet your boots that when you say, well, I couldn't give you this, we'll go all the way, we'll take a strike on this, the next time that you're not going to get it. And the only thing worse than doing that is the management rep or the chief executive officer, which happens every once in a while, who says, well, let them strike, we'll see if they really got it, and then we'll settle a day or two after the strike starts. Well, that's the kiss of death, because, the guy found out you were bluffing, and the next time you sit down, the game of bluff is not on the table. It's sheer bargaining power, and in fact is even a question of whether you really got the bargaining power. That will be questioned at the table, too. So it's bargaining power and bluff. That's all it is.
All right, you're in a negotiating situation, and you want to let the opposing party know that your positions are flexible, but you don't want to make any actual concessions. How do you go about doing that?
That largely depends on the quality of the person you're dealing with, and I suppose on your own quality also. If you're a sophisticated negotiator dealing across the table with another sophisticated negotiator, there are a lot of very easy, painless ways to get information across about your bargaining position. One of them is the drink in the local bar. That's a very popular tool for telling the other party just where your bottom lines are
That's
in
not
negotiations.
just a stereotype. That actually happens.
Oh, it happens quite frequently. Now, there are two ways that the drink in the local bar goes. One is that you're bargaining in the local bar where you say, well, geez, I can only give you 25 cents, where you really can give them 30. And that's a kind of a negotiation. That's very justified and very understandable. That's good communication. There's another system that goes, too, and if the opportunity is offered, you play the system, and that's where you meet with a guy and he says, look, my men want $1 an hour, but I think that's too much, and if I can sell them on 15 cents, will you guys take it? And you say yes, and then you work out a scenario for the next 20 negotiations of how he's going to beat them down from $1. That's got some ethical problems for the union agent. It doesn't bother me a bit, but for him it has a problem. But that's not a stereotype. It's really quite common with sophisticated negotiators. Or a phone call at home or a drink of coffee. It's not necessarily the bar, but the discussion on the side. Well, then the other way is right out at the table in front of everybody. You can do a lot of communication about what your issues are. The emphasis you place on an issue. If I go on for 20 minutes about a particular issue and point out why I have to have it and how important it is, the guy on the other side of the table is making an analysis of whether I'm just bluffing and puffing for my client, or whether I'm putting that much effort into it because I really want it. And most sophisticated negotiators can catch on to which it is pretty fast, whether it's a bluff or whether you really got to have it. Passing an issue on the table, you come to the arbitration clause, you say, well, let's pass that, we'll pick it up later, it would usually indicate that you're going to give it. Even though you don't want to say it at the table, you're willing to let that issue ride because you know you're going to give it. An unsophisticated negotiator across the table would demand to talk about it immediately. A sophisticated negotiator would know he probably's got it in his pocket if he does the right things and leave it alone. Using body language many times. A guy leans forward on the table and says he wants something. If he's smart and he knows I know body language, I know he's telling me something that his people may not pick up quite as quickly. And that can be effective. And I use that periodically. I will use positive body language because I want the guy on the other side of the table to know something. So I'll lean forward or I'll lean back or I'll put my foot on the table or something like that to indicate to him in a more subtle way what I'm trying to tell him.
You've raised, your last few comments have raised another question to me, and that's the relationship between you and the opposing negotiator. Do you take special efforts to size up the opposing negotiator to find out just what type of relationship you can have with that person?
Yeah, I think you have to. I think that's some major percentage of negotiation is the person you're dealing with across the other side of the table. I had a negotiation for about 2 years with one guy who, if he had been willing to talk to me and had understood the process, I probably could have given him deals that were 20 to 25% better than he was getting. But because he was a win-lose negotiator and we couldn't talk, and the few times we did talk, he either shot me down or didn't deliver on what he was doing, we went to win-lose negotiations and we beat him at the table because we had the power. It wasn't what my client really wanted to do, though. They wanted an accommodation with the man and to work with him, and they were willing to pay a fee for it across the table. But he couldn't accommodate, and it hurt his own people. So you've got to size up what you're dealing with and whether he has credibility and what the vibrations are. Where does he vibrate to certain things? I mean, I was walking down the street with a Teamster agent the other day who was very upset at one of my clients. And I said, you really shouldn't take this personally. They're not mad at you. They're merely trying to work this out with a couple of employees that have really been causing them a lot of trouble. It immediately reduced the tension load on the guy because he thought it was a personal attack on him. We got the thing into a discussion and we tried to work out a solution, which we couldn't do, but I took the tension out of that negotiation immediately.
Suppose you walk into a negotiations and this is the first time you met the opposing negotiator. How do you size up that negotiator? Obviously, maybe you probably have done some homework, which is probably part of the process.
The best part of it is, of course, asking another guy who's dealt with him. You try to find out who he's dealt with. If you can't do that, you try to do it through the negotiations themselves, the way he speaks. Maybe the most important thing is the sophistication level. If you're sophisticated in this process, you're usually a win-win negotiator and you're willing to talk on the side and you realize there's compromise. So you'll throw out an issue which is kind of complicated and see what he says back. I dealt with a guy about 5 years ago who came out of the blue because he was new to the entire state, so nobody knew him. And he sat down at the table, and he's wearing Levi's and an open shirt, and he's leaning back and giving all kinds of negative body language. Now, he wasn't really doing negotiations, but he was obviously influencing them tremendously. I said, Fred, how do you feel about this issue? And he said, well, there have been several decisions on that issue, and they've all held that that's not true. Well, that's all I needed to know. The guy was a lawyer. And as a lawyer, I knew what I was dealing with. At least I knew that he was coming in at a legal angle. I knew that he was probably sophisticated because he wouldn't have been hired in that position at that kind of money as a lawyer unless he was sophisticated. And I changed my whole negotiation strategy immediately. The fact is, we had been stalling negotiations. I called for a caucus about 20 minutes later. I went back in and I said, we are going to have comprehensive proposals on everything on the table within the next 24 hours. And sure enough, we did, and sure enough, it wasn't enough, and he pulled them out on strike. I mean, that's the change that comes from somebody like that sometimes.
All right. How do you get the opposing party to modify its position?
Well, I think you have to make a fundamental analysis of what the reason is that they're not moving their position. Many times an employee organization can't move its position because of outside forces. I just had a negotiation situation where the employee organization, a city, where the management was demanding that the employees give up Social Security, which is permissive in a city. And the employees couldn't move because there was a rump group of 20 employees on the outside of the negotiations who, every time that issue was mentioned, flew up in anger and caused a ruckus at the employee organization meetings. The way we got them off the dime was to bring in an outside consultant who, with credibility from another employee organization, who had gone in and proposed the dropping of Social Security to their organization, to their management structure. We brought him in. He spent several days talking to these employees and going through the structure with the blessings of that union leader, and he convinced them that they should drop it in exchange for certain concessions like long-term disability insurance and special health and retirement benefits that we were willing to pay for. He convinced the rump group We came back to the bargaining table after this hiatus period, and we settled that issue. Now, that's one way of doing that on the outside. So you have to make an analysis. If the problem is on the inside of the negotiating team, then many times the problem is solved by going outside. You communicate with the employees or with the public or with some decision-making group of what management's offer is, and that the only stumbling block is that two people on the team want a special benefit for themselves, which is not unusual. And when that word gets out, it undermines their credibility, and you can go on with your negotiations. Many times basic bargaining power, the threat of the strike, or the threat that management will take the strike. But I had one situation recently where, and it's an odd one, but the union had been negotiating with 3 separate companies, all doing exactly the same business for different customers, the service type industry. The union settled with one employer for less than it wanted to because the employees sold the union out, so that they got a less than an average increase, and they were very upset about it. The second employer was my client, was a really hard-nosed client that really wanted to rub him in the ground, and he wanted the same deal that the first employer got. The third client considered itself hard-nosed, but was softer and actually had a more militant group of employees. So the union switched its negotiations over to the third client, the third employer, trying to put the pressure on them where the militant employees were, take the strike, get the higher settlement, and then force employer number 2 to give the higher settlement than employer number 1 had gotten. We went to the union and said, we want to have a meeting. And the union said, we're too busy now, we can't see you for 2 weeks. So we called a meeting of all the employees, and we read them a telegram that we'd sent to the union, which said, it's very unfortunate that you can't meet with us. We are available tonight, all day tomorrow, and all day Sunday. But if you can't find time in those 3 days to meet with us, on Monday morning the doors will be closed. Well, the first thing the employees did was run for the phone and say, we're not prepared to, we don't have any money. No one knew we were going to be locked out. And we really didn't plan to lock them out. We were scared to death of this. But they called the union. The union calls me up, screams on the phone about what a bad faith bargainer I am and how bad I am. And I said, well, I just want to get your attention. And now that I've got your attention, let's set up a meeting. And we set up a meeting the next morning. We had a 3-hour bargaining session. They raged and fumed, and we settled for what employer A had, and we had a settlement on Monday morning. They had a ratification vote at the plant. And that's another way of going around when you analyze the problem. The problem there was the union business agent himself, and all we had to do was get around him.
What strategies can negotiators employ to get an opposing party to shift its position from a refusal to bargain to a willingness to compromise? In other words, from win-lose to bargaining.
Well, the most obvious way is to undermine his power base. If he thinks that he's got a heavy power base with the employees, and management feels that it can make a much more credible position with the employees, you go directly to them. The example of the union, which in bargaining for 10 employees couldn't give an increase. We couldn't take no increase at all. Had to have some kind of an increase. And you just bring all the employees into negotiations, all 10 of them. They all sit down there. They hear the management's position. At that point, you have really gone around the union agent. You've gone directly to the employees, and you take away his bargaining power because they say, we don't want to strike. This guy is telling the truth. That's the ultimate way to do it. Along those same lines, you can work the union along or work the management along into such a position that their bargaining power has dissipated. I saw a psychologist who's also a negotiator do that earlier this year. It was very clever. The union business agent wasn't too skilled at negotiations. He'd been around, but he'd never really had a strike before. But deep in his heart of hearts, he wanted one in the worst way so he could say he had been in the battle. And this psychologist sat across the negotiating table with him, and instead of taking it was strictly a win-lose negotiation from the union side of the table, instead of sucking into the win-lose thing, he kept working on a needs negotiation with the guy on the surface. But under the surface wasn't. Under the surface, he really understood the situation, but he kept talking needs. And the union guy took this for weakness. And as they went along and got closer to the strike deadline, there were more and more things that the union guy wanted to have settled before he went into the strike that weren't being settled. So finally, the night before the strike, he had a big meeting. He says, we're going to get more at the table. We're going to postpone the strike for 2 weeks. He wasn't smart enough to realize that postponing the strike, by his postponing the strike for 2 weeks, he took away his own credibility with his own members because they thought he was losing. The psychologist then pounced on the guy in the negotiations, and he withdrew roughly 14 or 15 proposals which he'd made at the table, which is unheard of in bargaining. I mean, to pull things back when you're at the nth hour is a bad thing to do. He pulled them back, but he did it on a needs basis. He said, I really would like to agree with you, but things have changed so badly that I'm being instructed to do this, so we'll work something else out to make up for this, but I'm going to have to take this one back. And he kept doing that for 2 weeks. And I'm giving this guy advice, and I'm just my eyes are in wide amazement as he pulls this off. And the guy actually, the union management negotiation, they actually wound up with less at the end of the 2-week hiatus period before the quote strike than the guy had on the night before his real strike. And his strike collapsed, and they settled. A very clever way to do it. You don't see that too often, but that's a way to do it.